Okay, hello all. Today we are continuing to talk about the Mongol conquest. We started out talking about it yesterday. We went over the sources a little bit, the brief history of Genghis Khan, born Timuchin, who rises meteorically and creates this massive empire that is quickly conquered, and that Genghis Khan himself died in 1227, even prior to the Mongol Empire reaching the extent, its territorial extent. And instead, it was divided up among his sons into four other hordes. Let me actually, this map shows you a little bit better. And now the quite well, here, let me just go to my notes. All right, and we talked about, last time we talked about Alexander Nevsky. Okay, so Mongol rule, what did it entail? First, just a couple of rules about succession, and pay attention here because we're going to talk a lot about succession when we talk about the Muscovite princes and how they did things. So when Genghis Khan passed away, it was divided, the territories that he had conquered plus were divided up among his four sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Agadai, and Tului. Here's a family tree of those, although Orda is missing on this genealogy. He should be there, a son of Jochi. As I mentioned to you, Jochi was not Genghis Khan's biological son, but was recognized as such, which I just pointed out to you as maybe an irony in history, in that the dynasty and the Chinggisid line was so important in establishing legitimacy. And yet here we had this legitimate Chinggisid descendant who was not a biological descendant, but was socially recognized as Genghis Khan's son, and therefore bore all the legitimacy that was afforded to his biological children as well. Now, the unity of the Mongol horde was short-lived. In just one generation, under Genghis Khan's grandsons, the realm fractures into four different hordes. Before it's all over, it will fracture into even more hordes than that. And the realm fractured into four hordes. It was still nominally allied to the Great Horde, which was headquartered up here in the Karakoram. Here's the Empire of the Great Khan, is what Kublai Khan, the title that Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and also founder of the Yuan dynasty of China, was called. And then Batu, with his capital in Sarai along the Volga River. So here's Old Sarai and New Sarai. Old Sarai 1242, New Sarai 1257, that they kind of moved it. The initial, that delta on the Volga is quite shifting, and maybe that had something to do with moving it. I don't know exactly. But so Batu sets up his horde over here and is seasonally sedentary at Sarai. And he controls the region from the Black Sea and the northern Caucasus. The Caucasus are this mountain range between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. It's the and now kind of Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan are the republics there. And just recently, in the last fall, war broke out between Armenian and Azerbaijani population enclaves in Azerbaijan. That's been a real crisis that the international community and Russia, spearheading the move, have worked to intervene to help things there. It is a land with a very, very complicated history. If you, in super rough terms, well, we'll talk more about this, if you have Orthodox Christianity at some point north of the Caucasus and in the Caucasus in the Republic of Georgia, then you have Islam here to the south, but the Turkic Islam that in large part was adopted was Sunni Islam, whereas the Persians of the Ilkhanate and spreading more into the lands of Azerbaijan adopted Shiite Islam. And so though there was quite a brew of tension and conflict and competing aspirations in these territories for centuries. And it's also, and during the Mongols and what we call the Pax Romana, there were totally accessible through, or quite used through very high mountain passes trade that passed through this part of the world. At any rate, so this territory is Batu's territory. Now, to the southwest, what had been Persia and the Abbasid Empire and would become known as the Ilkhanate was conquered by Hulagu in 1258. So its Mongol conquest gives way to the Ilkhanate, which will become what we think of as the medieval Persian Empire. Now, to the east and south of Mongolia proper, we have Kublai Khan, a grandson, ends up lording over what becomes China. And then right here in the middle, the heart of Central Asia, this part becomes known the Chagatai Horde. Now, there's a lot of, don't get bogged down on Blue Horde and White Horde and how that changes. But I do want you to know that you'll see all these maps and they say Golden Horde, Golden Horde, Golden Horde. But the term Golden Horde first appears in sources in the 17th century. So when no one was walking down to Sarai in the 1300s and saying, Han of the Golden Horde, I'm here to deliver the tribute. It was referred to as the Kipchak Khanate, or there were some other names as well. Historians argue about what exactly to call this, but no one in the 14th, 15th century was calling it the Golden Horde, even though that's what you see on all the maps now. And so I'll even use the term as well. I mean, rather than fight that battle, the Golden Horde pretty much refers to the Mongol conquered areas that became part of Russia. Now, the Central Asia, when the Mongols first conquered, was a place in which people, their religion has been described as Lamaist or paganist. There are a variety of religions. I think it's fair to say, following the historian Victoria Friede, that we don't really have atheists until the 19th century. Some people want to say that Voltaire in the 18th century was an atheist. I don't want to fight about that, but I think it's pretty fair to say that human societies, that atheism is a modern invention, and that human groups and societies had some sort of religion. Whatever these religions were, these animist religions is a good way of characterizing a lot of pagan religions that somehow sees in the elements metaphysical powers. It wasn't Islam. None of these people had for the most part, had taken, these people weren't monotheists, that is, that they worship one God. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, these are all monotheistic religions, Zoroastrianism, and they all really come on this screen of human history within, a millennia and a half of each other. So that's kind of spread apart. But anyway, a little after 1300, the Mongols convert to Islam. Han Uzbek is the first Mongol Han who embraces Islam. And so it's probably in somewhere between 1308 and 1313 when the Kievan princes bring their tribute, not to an animist Mongol, but they bring their tribute and give their abeyance to a Muslim Khan. And the Golden Horde, in Central Asia and then the Golden Horde, their leadership converts to Islam. In Persia and Mesopotamia, this is what becomes the Ilkhanate. And around 1300, that leadership, according to, this is the account given by Christian Beckwith in his Empires of the Silk Road, around 1300, they convert to Buddhism. But that choice is a bit short-lived, and the leader will fairly quickly embrace Islam and change the title from Han to Sultan. So sort of kind of picking up on local cues, perhaps. And I just mentioned this because when we think about does the leader come in and impose their own will, or does the leader come in and appropriate local ways of being? There we see a mix. In China, and by the way, the Ilkhanate is particularly interesting as well, because you have some of the Mongol leadership around who becomes the Sultan, embracing Christianity and dabbling in other faiths before kind of going with Islam. Resonates a little bit perhaps with the story we heard about Vladimir in the late 10th century. Over in China, in the east of Eurasia, the grandson Kublai, he conquers the Jin in the north and the Song in the south to found the Yuan Empire of China. And he moves his court from the Karakoram farther up in Eurasia to what we now know of as Beijing, which wasn't called that then. So these four hordes, these four hordes were originally allied to the Great Horde. They were headquartered in the Karakoram. We talked about Marco Polo, who returned to Europe from China around the year 1295, escorting the Han's daughter, who was betrothed to marry the Ilkhanate Han, illustrating those kinship ties that persisted despite the great distance between them. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it didn't take long for those bonds to weaken, and the kind of allied relations between these four hordes don't last long. The Golden Horde, and also there will even be more fracturing within these hordes that I'll mention. Of them all, the Golden Horde lasts the longest as a Mongol, as an entity ruled by descendants of Genghis Khan. So in just a few decades, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate go to war with each other. In the 1260s, they're fighting while still ruled by a grandson of Genghis Khan, and they're fighting over the territories of the Caucasus, as well as religion. Batu's brother, Berke, had converted to Islam, and therefore he objected to Hulagu's conquest of Baghdad, saying you shouldn't have conquered a Muslim city. And then relations between them further deteriorated because the annexation of the southern Silk Road routes, or routes along which trade and commodities are traveling from Central Asia by way of Persia to the southern Caspian Sea. So the southern tip of the Caspian Sea is also when Hulagu took that area, he deprived the Golden Horde of revenue they had been collecting, and so they retaliated against that. By 1262, the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde were at war with each other. Now, as I said, the Mongol conquest was expansive and dramatic. Its sustained political power was actually quite short-lived. In the East, Genghis Khan's line in China was ousted in 1368. In the Middle East, Genghis Khan's line was ousted from Baghdad in 1335. Now, perhaps this shouldn't survive us. This was a world in which political fragmentation had been the norm. And certainly Central Asian nomadic politics were even more prone to kind of a dynamism and turnover. Like the Roman Empire is a tremendous exception. If you remember maybe Alexander the Great, there's another flash in the pan for you. So perhaps don't be surprised that this formation that just spreads wildly quickly fragments again. In the Chagatai horde, the heart of Central Asia, in kind of the geography and lands that these people were most used to, perhaps it makes sense that that area fragmented the most quickly, as they just reverted to more typical ways of being, as opposed to finding yourself in a really foreign place and starting to do things quite differently, maybe assimilating habits of another area. Now, what was one of the reasons for this breakup? The Black Death had quite a bit to do with it, historians think. The Black Death hit the Golden Horde as well. Sarai, Astrakhan in the Caucasus, in Crimean ports in 1346 and 47. As you may have heard before in histories of Europe in your Western Civ class, it was the conventional wisdom for a very long time was that the Black Death spread to Europe when sieging Mongol armies catapulted body parts of infected people into to Europeans, and then those European boats traveled to Genoa and the south of Italy, and therefore spread through that as a consequence of biological warfare, the plague to Europe. That very famous account came from Guillaume de Missus, I think I'm mispronouncing his name. He was not an eyewitness and had not seen the event. And more recently, historians, and this is quite recent work that's relying on science to study genetic information to reach different conclusions. And Hannah Barker has made this important intervention to argue compellingly that it wasn't body parts being catapulted in siege warfare. It wasn't biological warfare, but rather just traveling on in the rats in the grain on boat ships that brought plague to a variety of ports in Europe around 1346, 47. So that's really, for me, this is exciting because this is really old history. People have been studying this a very long time, but that understanding is one that's just emerging in the last 2 years. But at any rate, so the Black Death is partly accounts for the end of the Yuan dynasty, and people could make arguments about Ilkhanate, etc. The Black Death hits Rus several times. It comes 3 times in the 14th century, and the historian Eve Levin estimates that perhaps a quarter of the population died. All these numbers are just so imperfect at best, but it had major effects. Even in my research, some of the merchants that I studied, because, well, the Black Death repeats over time. Some of the merchants that I study were killed by plague, and that's even a 17th century story. So the plague affected commerce negatively. The Mongols at both ends of their massive empire are affected, and but the Golden Horde, what will become Russia, is left behind. But it doesn't happen without crisis. From 1359 to 1379, there are a dozen different Hans that rule in Sarai. That sort of rapid turnover is a pretty good indication as a historical generalization of a regime that is not living its best life. Let's put it that way. And the horde fragments, the Golden Horde, the Kipchak Khanate, fragments into 7 polities. It too finds itself quite diminished as time goes by. In the 15th century, so now we were talking about conquest in the 1200s, the Khanate breaking up pretty quickly, even fighting with each other in the 1250s, and now I've kind of jumped forward a century, and talking about how the Kipchak Khanate, what we think of as the Golden Horde, is diminishing. So in the 15th century, Genghis descended Khanates declared their independence from Sarai, so the Kipchak Khanate itself, and it fragments even more. It breaks off into the Khanate of Kazan in 1438, the Crimean Khanate in 1441, the Astrakhan Khanate in 1466. And all of these Khanates are claiming a legitimacy based on lineage connected to Genghis Khan, but they're going their own way. And there were 7 different Khanates, but those names, the Khanate of Kazan, Crimean Khanate, Khanate of Astrakhan, they're going to come back into our story. So that's why I'm emphasizing them. Now, the Chagatai horde, covering the heart of Central Eurasia, as I said, broke up most quickly. It fragmented into the Nagai horde, the Kazakh horde, the Sibir hordes or Khanats. And maybe you've heard this name, Timurlane. Timurlane was a brilliant general who emerges from Samarkand, a city which is now in Uzbekistan, in the late 1300s. And he briefly, he was a tremendously successful a successful warrior. Timur the Lame, he limped from a childhood injury, and he attempted to reconstitute the Mongol Empire during his reign, which lasted from 1370 to 1405. But this, again, here I'm getting at this point about the importance of genealogy. He was of mixed Mongol descent. He was not through the male line of the Chinggisid line, and he never claimed to be so. It was sort of like a bit of a spot on his record, and maybe it hampered his potential at any rate. In his wake, however, the Shaibanids and Uzbeks, whose lineages did follow the Chinggisid line, they reconquered the heart of Timur's domain. And so thus, although unified Mongol rule was as ephemeral as it was swift, the same cannot be said of its legacy, especially in Eurasia, where kinship to Genghis Khan remained a central organizing principle for centuries, until in many cases, the Russian conquest, which happens in the mid-19th century. All right, I want to say a few words about Mongols and religion. And I see you've been looking at the same slide for a while. That's not that, well, whatever, let's see. Yeah, okay. Mongols and religion. If religion was the reason behind the fighting between Genghis's grandsons ruling the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, part of it, it was uncharacteristic of the Mongols. For while they could be and were ruthless and sometimes merciless conquerors, Mongols seemed to recognize that different people followed different faiths, and they displayed an adaptable stance towards those identities. And we've already talked about them taking on different religions early in their conquest days. In the heart of Central Asia, Mongols ruled over a world that was already largely Islamic. The Chagatai Khanate was populated mostly by Turkish nomads, many of whom had converted to Islam. It was also home to Bukhara and Samarkand, two important centers that became important centers of Islamic scholarship, but also had other religious faiths in them, going back to the Sogdians and fire worshiping. At any rate, Kaidu, who was a great grandson of Genghis Khan, died in 1301, and he wasn't Muslim. So there you have half a century presence not taking on the local religion. There's an example. It's not just one story here. But over the first quarter of the 1300s, many Mongol Khans, including Uzbek Sarai, did embrace Islam. Genghis Khan had no great respect for Islam, by the way. The historian Abu Ghazi records the Mongol conquest, and he said that when Genghis Khan came into the city of Bukhara, he denigrated the mosque by eating in it, and he had horses trample the Quran under their feet in the mosque. That said, the Mongols didn't persecute for religious beliefs and were even tolerant of religious diversity, although don't take diversity in a 20th century sense at all. We'll talk more about that. But the Mongols, they allowed the founding of an archbishopric of the Orthodox Church in Sarai. And they also granted the Orthodox Church tax exemption on the condition that they would pray for the Khan. You know, I may not believe in your God, but hey, pray for me anyway. Maybe it can't hurt. At the height of their military conquests, the Mongols were pagans or shamanists, some say Buddhists, but they consciously experimented with religion and came to adopt local religions, as I've just been talking to you about. And so that, I just wanted to kind of put that out there about Mongols and religion. Now, a final note, getting ready to bring our story back to Muscovy, where we're going next. And that has to do with the legacy of the Mongols. Now, here, by the way, so you can see all these maps. Technically, seeing Golden Horde, it's an anachronism, as we talked about. But let's talk a little bit about the legacies of the Mongol yoke. Raise your hand if you've heard this term, the Mongol yoke, before. Okay, all right, so the majority of you haven't. In my world, among Russian historians, everyone's heard this. And the Mongol yoke is this idea that as a result of the Mongol conquests, Russia developed these certain characteristics. And those characteristics are that Russians are eternally suspicious of outsiders, that they're so suspicious of outsiders, and they live in this place where they were attacked by nomads, not having natural boundaries of real rivers or oceans or impassable mountains, that they developed a defensive aggression, that they needed a buffer zone. And so Russians are always interested in expanding their territory. And even in the wake of, the 2014 annexation of Crimea and relations between the United States, consequently, not only because of the annexation of Korea, but also because of Russian attempted interference in our domestic politics, the press about Russia has gotten increasingly negative in what some would even characterize as a new Cold War. And we hear again and again that, or I see the occasional headline about Putin trying to reconstitute the Russian Empire or reconstitute the Soviet Union, because it is in the Russian DNA to just want to expand. And that premise, which I don't agree with, and I'll kind of share with you some historical examples as we go through that course, but that premise is in some ways rooted in this idea of the Mongol yoke, that the Mongols just hammered these people so bad for centuries that they fear outsiders, they're eternally suspicious, and they feel like they need to advance, that the best defense is a good offense, and that they need to have a buffer zone. And another sense of it is that as a result of being under the Mongol yoke of despotic Mongol rulers, that Russians have assimilated those traditions and habits of having a despotic ruler, that Russians couldn't really handle democracy anyway, as well as a country like the United States of America could. The responsibility, the civic the civic obligations entailed therein, because they're not, because of the Mongol yoke. I'll kind of stop there, but there is this real, and you'll see it again and again. Russians, they like despotic rulers. They need autocracy. They can't rule themselves. All of these truisms and cultural, because effectively they say something about the nature of Russian people, are often attributed to why is this happened? This happened because they were under the Mongol yoke for so long. Now I want to kind of challenge that conception. Although when I just think about headlines and bylines that I'll read, I don't even read the whole article. When I see some newspaper article telling me about how Russians can't handle democratic rule and are just looking to reconstitute their empire. But I see it again and again. The historical record presents a somewhat different picture. I don't want to expand. I don't want to talk too long on this, because you've already been listening and I'm talking for a while. But really quickly, what am I talking about? So, in this Mongol yoke idea would kind of give us this idea that Slavs just walked around, cowering in fear and handing over their goods and in tribute to to brutal Mongols for centuries on end. But the historical record doesn't actually hold up that image. If you recall, even when I first introduced these people, in the Chronicles, I mentioned to you how we had some inkling about some Rus princes cooperating with them against other Rus princes. And so that, and just little inklings, even in the Chronicles. And I say even in the Chronicles because there's a reason why we wouldn't expect that sort of treatment from the Chronicles. And that reason is these Chronicles were written by Orthodox churchmen that had were quite disinclined to say anything good about pagan Muslims. So the history of the Mongols in the Russian Chronicles is one of the places where we really find this story about how bad and awful the Mongols were, these infidels that that God punished Christians with, right? It's the Russian Chronicles that put forward that story, put forward that narrative. The few documents we have about how states operated tell a quite different story. Linguistically, there are many words that have to do with governance that are derived from the Mongol language. The words for trade, dingi is money, is derived from a Mongol word. Yam is kind of a postal stop along the way. This is a Mongol term. Kazna, treasury, this is a Mongol term. There's well over a dozen administrative words for in the Russian language that derive from the Mongol language. And as I said, the Mongols weren't there lording over the Rus constantly. They outsourced their tax collection to other princes, and Slavic princes, as I mentioned briefly, and I'll talk about more, competed for that right to deliver the tribute. And so, and also there are some Slavic princes that married Mongol women as well. One example of, and this was a status gainer. I'll show you a slide of that when I talk about Muscovy. So basically, if you were to read the Chronicles, you could be forgiven for getting this picture of this brutal Mongol yoke of infidel just hammering Christians over the centuries. But when we look at other sources, government document sources, for example, there's a different, they're not telling a story outright, but it suggests a different dynamic. And that has led to one historian that's written about this, Donald Ostrowski, and Charles Halpern writes, Charles Halpern, in this book, Russia and the Golden Horde, he puts forth this ideology of silence, where the churchmen that wrote Russia's history in this critical period where it starts really producing written sources were religiously disposed against kind of acknowledging interaction, that you might have had Christian princes marrying a Tartar princess. That wasn't the story that they wanted to tell. They really wanted to hold those religious lines. And that is where Charles Halpern develops this idea of an ideology of silence about how that history played out. I mean, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture of the Mongols. Yeah, blood was shed. They killed people, and they occasionally revisited and sacked Russian towns again when they felt like a prince had gotten out of line or behaved in a way they didn't want them to behave. So I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture, but at the same time, that kind of simplistic Mongol yoke of unrelenting oppression by outside Tatars on the Christian Slavs doesn't tell us the whole story. And I would go further that this idea of the Mongol yoke as a legacy that's lived on even longer than Chinggisid legitimacy in Central Asia as how we understand kind of moving forces in Russian history, I think has also been of outsized consequence for how we understand the Russian past. And it isn't just us. Russians, it's easy to find Russians who very much take up this, oh, the reason we're like that is because of the Mongols. All right, with that, I'll turn off the recording and we can take some questions.